Today, we're going full-on digital detective. We're cracking the code on something that is, quite literally, shaping our future, the secret life of AI chips. And our crime scene? It's hidden in massive global datasets.
So, let's just jump right in with the big question, right? How in the world do you find a computer chip that, for all intents and purposes, doesn't want to be found? Especially when the folks moving it around are basically experts at covering their tracks.
Yeah, because this isn't about following a truck down a highway. The trail is digital. It's buried, deeply buried, inside this tangled global web of trade data. It's a network that was built for speed and efficiency, but that same complexity? It's perfect for hiding things in plain sight.
And that brings us to the first chapter of our story here. Let's call it the case of the missing chips.
So here's the setup. You've got this high-stakes global tech race, right? And to control it, these new rules, these export controls have been slapped on the most powerful AI hardware. But the real question, the multi-billion-dollar question is, are they even working? Or is the whole system just, found a clever new way to operate in the shadows?
Okay, so how do we even begin to find the answer? Well, you can't just look at the surface-level data. You have to dig deeper. And for that, you need what's basically a digital forensic toolkit. We're talking about some really clever analytical tools that are designed to sniff out the truth that's hiding deep inside all those numbers.
All right, first things first in any investigation, you got to make sure your evidence is legit. So we check the data for fingerprints, so to speak, using this really cool statistical trick called Benford's law. Think of it like a natural lie detector for huge sets of numbers. Turns out, in most real-world data, the number 1 shows up as the first digit way more often than any other number, about 30% of the time. And look at this. The data we're using follows that pattern almost perfectly. So what does that tell us? The evidence is clean, we can trust it.
Okay, on to our next tool, and this one is really clever. It's called physicality correlation. The idea is actually super simple. You've got these powerful AI brains. That's the chip, right? Well, they generate a ton of heat. They absolutely cannot function without equally powerful lungs. We're talking massive cooling systems. The point is, one is useless without the other. They have to move together.
And this chart, wow, this just shows you exactly what happens when they don't move together. See the red line? That's the dollar value of the chips being imported. The blue line is the weight of all that cooling gear. For a while, they're basically holding hands, moving in sync. But then, bam! Look at those huge spikes in the value of the chips, with no matching increase in cooling hardware. That is a massive red flag. It's a huge clue that tells us these chips probably aren't being installed. They're being stockpiled or maybe rerouted somewhere else.
And our last tool is something called counterfactual modeling. It sounds complicated, but it's a fascinating idea. We basically use an AI to build a ghost timeline. It's a simulation of what the world should have looked like, a prediction of what trade patterns would be if these new rules had never even happened. This gives us a perfectly clear baseline of what should be, so we can compare it to what actually is.
All right, we've got our toolkit, we've got our baseline, now it's time to follow the money and see where this trail leads.
And the very first thing we find is a huge number. We're talking $17.63 billion. That's how much hardware the AI predicted should exist in the trade data. But when you look at the official numbers, it's just gone. It vanished.
And this is where you can actually see it. That blue dashed line, that's our ghost timeline, what the AI said should have happened. The solid red line is reality, what actually happened after the rules kicked in. And that massive gap between them, that is our $17.63 billion ghost deficit.
Okay, so here's where the story gets really weird. When something becomes scarce, what's supposed to happen to the price? It goes up, right? Basic supply and demand. Economists even have a name for it in these situations, the smuggler's tax. But the data showed the exact opposite. Prices actually went down. What is that? A smuggler's discount? It makes no sense. And this chart just drives that point home. See that dotted red line? That's when the new rules started. And look at the price, the green line. It almost immediately drops below the historical average. This is a huge puzzle. Think about it. Why on earth would something that's suddenly harder to get also become cheaper? This tells us our first theory, that it's all about smuggling high-end chips. That might be totally wrong.
So this discovery completely changes the investigation. We're not just looking for some simple smuggling ring anymore. No, this points to something way more sophisticated. We have to start searching for a secret, highly coordinated network, one that's playing a completely different game.
So how do you find the members of this secret network? Well, you use something like this, a correlation heat map. It sounds technical, but just think of it like this. The brighter the spot, the more two countries are acting like clones. Their trade patterns are moving in perfect sync. And those bright yellow squares, those are entire clusters of nations whose economies are dancing to the exact same beat. They're effectively acting as one big, coordinated machine.
And we can get even more granular. We can start to figure out who's playing what role in this network. This chart here maps the brains, the chip value, against the lungs, the cooling hardware. The countries up in the top right, they're the AI superpowers. They're buying both, which means they're building real, actual data centers. But then look down in the lower right. Lots of high-value chips, but not much heavy cooling gear. These aren't the final destinations. These are the crucial middlemen, the hubs for assembly and shipping. So, we followed all the clues, the missing billions, the backward prices, this strange synchronized network, and it all leads us to a pretty shocking conclusion.
Okay, so this next piece of evidence is maybe the most mind-blowing. The researchers mapped out what they call the transactional DNA of every single country. Basically, it ignores politics, it ignores geography, and it just groups nations based on the deep structural patterns of how they trade. And what they found? Well, it was a genuine shock.
Because if you look closely, right there in that tight little cluster of green dots, you'll find both the United States and China. Let that sink in for a second. What this means is that despite everything you hear about political divides and tech wars, at a fundamental, structural level, their economic DNA, the way their AI supply chains are built to operate, is almost identical.
Basically, their systems are so deeply intertwined, they're built to work together. The original research puts it perfectly, saying the transactional DNA of these powers remains inextricably linked, forming a unified macro region based on industrial interoperation. In simple terms, they're still deeply structurally dependent on each other, whether they like it or not.
So let's just recap the evidence, all the final clues. First, a massive $17.63 billion ghost deficit just appears out of nowhere. Second, prices drop when every economic textbook says they should have skyrocketed. This suggests the market isn't about smuggling the newest chips, but about re-optimizing around older, more available tech. And the final nail in the coffin? The transactional DNA test shows that even the biggest rivals are still part of the same deeply intertwined system.
And when you put all that evidence together, it leads you to one final, really challenging question. If the global supply chain for AI is this tangled, this structurally interconnected, if the systems of the biggest rivals are basically codependent, then what does winning a tech war even mean? What could it possibly look like?